Hello, friends. This is Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 89, and I'm joined by one of my favorite guests to have on the show. That is Mr. Keith Knight. And I'm going to do a screen share here of his amazing, excellent YouTube channel. If you haven't checked it out already, here it is. I will link it in the show notes page. Otherwise, do you have a short URL link, Keith?
You know what? No, I don't.
Okay. Well, I'll just put the link in the show notes page. But today we're going to be tackling the social contract. I just did an episode on libertarian theory of contracts at libertyweekly.net/88. But I'll also be referring to my episode on the Constitution of No Authority at libertyweekly.net/28 and the real Magna Carta, which is libertyweekly.net/58. And we're going to try and keep this one under 30 minutes, so it'll be real short and punchy for you guys. But without further ado, Keith Knight, how's it going, buddy?
It's going fine, Patrick. Thank you for having me on, brother.
Awesome. Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. You haven't been on the show for quite some time. So why don't you frame this issue for us? I think you're going to take the ANCAP philosophical perspective, and I'll hammer at it from a little bit more of a legal perspective. But why don't you frame the issue for us?
So basically, I just see the social contract as the claim that the citizenry of a certain geographical area have a obligation to pay taxes to an entity, the state, one entity that has a monopoly on this, and they have a moral obligation to abide by those laws. The reason they have an obligation to pay the state and to abide by the laws of the state is because there is a social contract that in order for us to live together and have our rights protected, there needs to be one state to enforce such rule of law. The myth that this stands on, there's a couple. The claim that there is a social contract does not explain why this group, the Congress group, the government group, the police group, why they get to enforce it and not me and my 535 closest friends. So the question is, what is so unique and specific about this group? Why did they get the right to do this? So the reason I have the right to do what I want with my body and do what I want with my house is because I've acquired the property through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. The state, on the other hand, does not have that objective link. So when they say we are special, we are the enforcers of the social contract, you have to explain why. Is it because the state is so much more moral? The people who it's filled with are so much smarter? Is it because they're so much more honest? Why do they have this right that no one else has? Second, if the claim is that there's a contract, it sort of means that there's obligations to meet on both ends. However, when something like Pearl Harbor happens, let's not even get into that, but Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett is the book to read on Pearl Harbor. You can also see my interview with Scott Horton. If the citizenry is not protected, it's not really clear what happens. Does that mean they can now opt out of the contract and no longer have to fund the state? They no longer have to follow the laws? Does government go to jail? Because we go to jail if we don't hold up our end. Is there anything the state could do that would make it so the social contract is no longer in effect? I mean, something like show trials or even if it's something like what happened to me, I was held up on a bad part of town in Arizona, and I was a minarchist at the time, and that really showed me that the social contract doesn't exist because I got robbed, and then I called the police, and there was just nothing I could do. I'm like, okay, so you're not going to find the guy. None of my stuff was taken, but my friend's stuff was, and if you don't recover it, then you know what? I get to have, I should be able to hold a gun anytime, concealed whenever I want, if you guys aren't going to protect me. So I sent that email to the police station, and they didn't even respond to me. So that really made it clear to me that there's nothing that this other party in the contract can do for it to be invalidated. So I think those two examples, the fact that what makes the state unique is nothing. Well, what really makes them unique is people imagine that they have the right to rule others. It's a totally religious belief. It's also a cult. The second reason I would say is simply because there's no way to measure whether the second party, Congress, police, the military, nothing they can do can exempt them can allow us to opt out of the contract. Therefore, it's not a contract, and it's also totally immoral. If anyone else were to try to issue such a contract, it would be seen as ridiculous. For example, you have to do what I say and give me money, but every 4 years you get to vote between me and someone else. It's based on the assumption that I have the right to rule in the first place. This is the flaws I see in the social contract argument from Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes to even people like Sam Harris. So that is my position. That's why I understand it to be a legitimate. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I was going to try and come at this from a, like an etymological, show the etymology of the social contract. Of course, it kind of begins with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. But I think the irony in this is that, the social contract theory is kind of a creation of classical liberalism itself. Because as you go throughout the years, it really starts with the Anglo-Saxons, and I'm referring to my Real Magna Carta episode, libertyweekly.net/58. But, you have the Anglo-Saxons in England, and then in 1100 AD, there's the Norman invasion. And the Anglo-Saxon system was a bit more where we get our like libertarianish legal principles, the Western tradition from. But then the Normans come in, and the Norman kings have so much more power. And then people are scrambling for some authority for which to try and, argue against the king. Usually it ends up being a practical one where the king wants money for his wars. And so he creates central banking and all these different things. But the parliament always controls the purse strings. So it goes from the king having divine right to the king only having divine right when he sits with parliament, to then having parliamentary sovereignty. And then the American Revolution happens, and you have this idea of popular sovereignty. And as this progression is happening, you get these theories that come out. And from kind of classical liberalism, you get this idea of there being a social contract with mutual obligations on behalf of the citizenry and the monarch, right? So it's kind of an ironic that we're picking apart the social contract because people like Rousseau, who at least gave lip service to liberty, I think, someone like John Locke, who supported the social contract theory in his second treatise of government. So you're getting these differing things. But at the end of the day, I think the social contract is more of an allegory or a metaphor. And my whole point is that, and I kind of tackle this in Liberty Weekly and the Constitution of No Authority, libertyweekly.net/28, is that, in order for the social contract to have any sort of bearing in real life, it has to have some kind of grounding in a legal principle and some kind of real tangible principle. So you always come back to the Constitution, at least in the United States, and the Constitution is either a law or a contract. And so I kind of wanted to pick apart this idea that the Constitution is a law or a contract, or that any constitution could be a contract or a law. So should I go into that, or do you have something else to add there, Keith?
No, I'd be happy to hear your take on that.
Okay. And then I'll throw it back to you after I kind of tackle these. So, and you could probably chime in on this one too, because Tom Woods had this great episode. I can't remember the number, but I sampled it in episode 28, The Constitution and No Authority. But there's this myth of political representation. And right, if the Constitution is a social contract, then the Constitution at least purports to have this idea of popular sovereignty, the popular will of the people, right? Well, if you kind of pick that apart, and Keith, you'd probably really help here too. what is an agent? You know, in the private sphere, when you hire someone, there's this agency relationship. It's a legal doctrine of agency, is that someone has to do what you say. So we have this disconnect between, in the private sphere, if someone is your agent, they are bound to do what you say. They have a fiduciary duty to you in some aspects. Your lawyer has to represent your best interests by law. That's part of the partnership. But then all of a sudden in the political sphere, you know, we have representatives where, you know, let's say Bernie Sanders is, if you live in Vermont and Bernie Sanders is your representative in the Senate, he's a senator, yeah, in the Senate. Well, you didn't vote for Bernie Sanders. He is not bound to do what you say. You know, you probably don't even like Bernie Sanders. Where does this disconnect come in? How come on one hand we can have political representation with no personal, you know, legal duties between the senator and his constituents, but on the other hand, in the private sphere, the sphere in which we all live, you know, there's these very, very strict rules when it comes to agency. So what do you think about that, Keith?
Well, this goes to show the religion of statism, that if I hired Bernie Sanders privately and said, Bernie, you're my agent, you get to, you know, sell this book on my behalf, then Bernie starts speaking ill of the book. He starts misrepresenting what it's really about. You know what, Bernie? You're fired. This is no longer. Everyone would respect my right to do that if he were a private individual. But there's something about him getting a job with the state that sort of gives him this halo of legitimacy, to where regardless of my opinion of him, if it's not at the right election date, or I don't get enough votes, or maybe I do get the votes, but I don't get the electoral college votes, then I'm still stuck with him and I can't opt out. Now, you have to ask, at what point are the people not being represented when there's a 6%, between 6 and 11% are the numbers I see on Pew Research, of who feel of Congress's approval rating. Like, does it have to get down to 0 for these people? I mean, it really shouldn't. You should be allowed to say, you know what, this person doesn't represent me, as we do in the private sector. So when even 49% of a populace says, this person does not represent me, they still get to claim that they do, only through the religion of statism. Another thing is that even if they lie, so let's say you vote for George H.W. Bush in 92 or 88 because you're a total moron. You vote for the CIA agent, George H.W. Bush. Also, read the Franklin cover-up for more on George H.W. Bush. You vote for him because he will not raise your taxes. He promises it. When you blatantly break the promise, does that then void the contract? Right at that point, you should be able to kick them out. You know, if you're renting your house to someone and you say, well, you can't go in this room, and you catch them going in, then they have to leave. I mean, the fact that this general understanding is not applied to the state is ridiculous. When Obama says we'll get out of Iraq, and then he reinvades, but whether or not you think that was the right thing to do, it's still a lie. When he says no one's health care is going to be affected by this, and 6 to 9 million people lose their coverage, that's a lie. You got to be able to void that freaking contract right away. And the fact that people don't apply those same standards to the state just goes to show you that the social contract under any other circumstances would be totally laughed out of the park.
Right. And so when we talk about the Constitution being the closest thing to this idea of a social contract, or the allegory of what a social contract is, Lysander Spooner is kind of a positivist, and I have some quibbles with him that, you know, is for another episode. But he really says, you know, if the document, the Constitution, is based off of this idea of popular sovereignty, which it purports to be, if the Constitution is seen as a law, you know, only 1/6 of the people then existing could vote for their representatives, their state representatives, who ended up, you know, signing the Constitution and ratifying it. So you're really even getting this degrees of separation between this idea of popular sovereignty. You have, only 1/6 of the people can vote, and we're no fans of democracy here. But if the document is purporting to represent the idea of popular will, then you should have at least more than 1/6 of the people then existing voting on it. Yeah, that would seem to be, a logical connection. Um, Now we're kind of venturing into the idea of the social contract being a contract. And when you have high contracting parties in the world of legalese, you can have, they have this idea that like political units can enter into contracts, which is bogus. They would call that a compact, which is basically just a contract for high contracting parties. Um, it's just, I think, a bogus idea on its face. But there are rules for contracts, and I've said this in episode 28 as well. I just had the episode 88 talking about a libertarian theory of contract. But all contracts have to have three things, as I outlined in those episodes. You have to have mutual assent, which there's sub elements beneath all these elements that must also be met. But broad brushstroke speaking, you need to have mutual assent, which consists of offer and acceptance. You can't have vague terms. You have to have well-defined parties. Those are some things that go into offer and acceptance. You also have to have consideration, which we quibbled with in this episode. Under a libertarian theory of contract, you would have consideration would be replaced by evidence of title transfer or pledges of title transfer between the two parties. So you have to have all three things: mutual assent, consideration, or title transfer, or a lack of defenses to contract formation. And I mean, we're just gonna put these all to bed one at a time. Mutual assent. Well, who's the offeror? Who's the offeree in the Constitution? Well-defined parties. Is it everyone then existing? Is it everyone then existing and their posterity? Who is the government? What are these duties defined? I mean, talk about vague terms. What the hell does general welfare mean? What does that mean? Courts have been trying to decide what that means for centuries. General welfare. Regulate interstate commerce. Okay, what does that mean? Keep and bear arms. What does that mean? Well-regulated militia. What do those terms mean? What, like, and you can't tell me that there's an actual definition, because, one decade the Supreme Court might have one interpretation, in the next decade that's totally out the window, for the most part. So also, title transfer, if we're going by the libertarian theory of contracts, there is no title transfer or pledge of title transfer at all to speak of in the Constitution, period. What is the consideration, even if there's a bargain for exchange? What exactly are the people giving up in exchange for protection? And what exactly is the government providing? These things all just fall on their face. And then, in order for a valid contract to be formed, you have to have a defense to contract formation, or a lack of defenses. Well, what are some of those defenses? Coercion. If there's coercion, there is no contract. That's the biggest one. Well, you can pick that apart in a second here, Keith, when I hand it off to you. Another thing is unconscionability. Are we going to hold these people to these wishes, even when it would be at the severe detriment of one party? Are we going to enforce this contract? Another thing would be incapacity. I would argue that if you're going to bind your posterity to this contract for time and all eternity, those people not yet living, they are incapacitated. They have not reached the age of minority. They don't even exist. How can you bind them to this contract? And so those are just a few surface level quibbles, but I'll hand it off to you, Keith.
Well, it's incredible. There's $20 trillion of debt that's owed by people who never even voted. So even if you buy into the status myth that they represent you, you voted for them. Well, a lot of people didn't vote and voted against them. Do they have to pay? Well, yeah. So that's a major inconsistency we'd never accept anywhere else in life. And then building up debts for people that aren't even born yet. That's why I love the meme of the baby in the fetus signing the social contract. Like, it's that ridiculous. If any other person or group did that, I'm sorry to keep making that analogy, but it's so freaking ridiculous. So as far as vague terms go, well, the state loves the vague terms, or they just lie about what a term means. So my understanding is that in 1787 era, regulate meant to make regular, or to sort of adjust to certain circumstances. So regulate interstate commerce. I understand that. I could be wrong on this. But I got that from etymologyonline.org. Should have pulled that up. But yeah, to regulate interstate commerce meant to void the Articles of Confederation where states could tariff each other, and to regulate it, as in to make it regular, as in there's a total actual free trade, not this NATO nonsense, of interstate commerce. So then Roosevelt says, well, we can basically coercively control the agriculture industry. Why? Because we're just regulating interstate commerce. Now regulate means to violently dominate all of a sudden. Or a well-regulated militia. George Mason, the author of the Bill of Rights, one of them, said the militia is in 2 words, the people. That's according to a Mark Passio presentation called The Second Amendment, Its Purpose and Precedent, I think is the title. So we have the authors saying what it means, but even if that's what it does mean, that doesn't obligate future generations and future representatives to abide by such things. But that's the power of the state. Promote the general welfare. If it wasn't just stupid on their end, or they weren't thinking of it, it has to be like the greatest ploy that's ever been pulled, because really anything can go off that. You could have you could usher in communism, so long as you were doing it to promote the general welfare. Now, Ayn Rand would always say that the thing about dictatorship is not that it's bad, but that it's so arbitrary. So at any time, something can be enforced, and it's almost random. So what this does is it gets people on edge to sort of censor themselves. So when you use vague terms plus arbitrary enforcement, you totally get the populace to recognize you as legitimate, to follow your laws, to not want to evade taxes or to evade regulations, even if it means funding a genocidal war in Yemen or a starvation blockade of the German nation in the First World War. The arbitrary enforcement, I think, is another key element to this, because, of course, what's more arbitrary than this group, the state, can do things no other group can?
Well, when I say vague terms, let me give you an example too. Say that, you have a school, a law school, and it's a private school. They hire private security to regulate the classrooms and the grounds of the school, right? Well, does that mean that, regulate, maybe this isn't as great of an example as it was in my head, but does that mean like to regulate the noise levels in the room? Well, they say regulate interstate commerce, but what I mean by vague terms, this isn't exactly applicable to the Constitution. But if they just have a term that says regulate, well, what does that entail? What are their powers then? Can they physically remove people from the classroom? Can they say no talking? This is a silent area, and so you really need to fleece out what these things mean. Does the government have the power to do X? Maybe kind of a poor example, but when I'm, or if you have like a snow removal contract, you need to know exactly what is happening between these two parties.
Sure, and that's the power of people being able to opt out. If I know for a fact that if I get into this group, the other party can't opt out, you're going to attract the greatest psychopaths to that group. So once they're there, they know you can't opt out. There's very little to no incentive to provide a quality product or service or abide by the contract as it is. Whereas if I know my tenants, my consumers, my employees, if I know they could leave on a dime and do business with a competitor, I'm not going to be like, promote the general welfare. I got you on a technicality. Now you have to fund this $1 trillion Operation X, whether you like it or not, because I know that they can go elsewhere. And this is one of the main reasons everything needs to be privatized, despite the fact that it's the only moral way to do anything. It also has this great utilitarian benefit of, even if you're a totally evil psycho, just out of the self-preservation of it and you wanting good stuff, you're not going to try and get all technical with people, or you're not going to pull some Larry Silverstein nonsense where they sell him the towers like months before they fall down, and he gets the state to give him billions in insurance money because of how they define the attacks, even though they were filled with asbestos. So the fact that one party in this so-called contract does not have the ability to opt out, that is basically an invitation for terrible people to go to the state and enforce the contract on their own terms, which end up sucking because they know, being the psycho boyfriends that they are, they know they're not going to let us go anywhere else without their permission.
Right. Yeah. And well, to just touch on the vague terms again, like, due process, what does that mean? Right. In the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, what does due process mean? Well, the courts have interpreted it to mean notice and an opportunity to be heard. But what does that all entail? It's different in every state according to what the courts find. Or constitutionally, there's one. Anyway, but when it comes to the snow removal contract, when like, let's say I have a business and I have a fleet of equipment, but I hire a third-party contractor to come in and I give them power to regulate my fleet of snowblowers. Well, does that mean that they can destroy my snowblowers and replace them with better snowblowers? Does that mean that they can remove safety features to their will and regulate it because it helps them? You get the point. But the one last thing that I wanted to end on, as opposed to regular contracts that have very solidly defined terms, and if these terms are vague, then there is no contract for want of vagueness. But the last thing that I wanted to hit on, because we're running out of time here, was just this idea of, a contract doesn't mean anything if there's no party to enforce said contract, right? If it doesn't matter. There is an agreement, maybe morally speaking, but let's say, and that's why Rothbard would say that the countries of the world already exist in a state of anarchy in international law, because, well, now we have NATO and we have, the US empire to enforce treaties, or the UN. But before that, if the US made a trade agreement or a protection agreement with Mexico, and Mexico is attacked and destroyed, well, who's going to enforce that treaty? So who's going to enforce the social contract?
Yes, and the thing about going through the state, let's say you're in a contract with someone and they openly are in violation of the terms, it still doesn't necessarily make sense to sue them, take them to court, hire lawyers, take the days off work, spend the time, money, and effort to make your case. Sometimes it makes more sense to either do it privately, and I'm not very familiar with how that works, but all I know is that the antidote to corruption is competition. So anytime someone will say, but what if there's a private agency and they're corrupt, and they come up with, there's a million examples in a way. You could be corrupt or lazy or uncaring. All those also apply to current state courts. The difference is you can voluntarily associate with them and fund them. So I think we not only have the philosophical case against the foundation of the social contract, even in a utilitarian sense, you're benefiting yourself much less when you give one group a monopoly on enforcement and interpretation of the contract. So I really think we got it on all grounds here.
Yeah, right on. And I'm glad that you picked that up too. And it kind of came full circle there. Like, who's going to enforce this contract, or who's going to even hear your dispute with this contract? Well, the state. They have a monopoly on arbitration, so you can bring your complaints to the same department that forced you into this contract.
Well, and also, you've got to see the conflict of interest. When there's a state employee at a state court, I mean, come on, a Walmart employee at a Walmart court. You've got to see that there's a conflict of interest, whether it's just a general understanding of it's in my interest to protect these people, this institution. And again, that could also apply to private courts, but I wouldn't be forced to fund them. And that's what would make them better actors in the marketplace overall.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, I think we've reached our time limit here, but Keith, do you want to point everyone, send them somewhere? Twitter, YouTube?
So you can follow me on Twitter at @AN_capitalist. You can check out my YouTube, BitChute, and Minds.com channel. And all of those are just Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. I'll be the first result on those. So I hope people will check out my interviews. I've had interviews with Walter Block, Scott Horton. I have one with Robert Murphy, so subscribe now. And that'll be out later this month. And I have another one with the guy who really exposed postmodernism and cultural Marxism, Professor Stephen Hicks. That's coming out later this month too. So please check out my stuff and share it, download it. I, of course, am not going to copyright you like I was by the people at PorkFest when I downloaded one of their videos, which was terribly sad. So yeah, please check me out there and share my stuff. I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, right on. I would definitely encourage everyone who listens to the Liberty Weekly podcast to go check out Keith's stuff. He's one of the best friends of the show, and he has one of the best ANCAP YouTube channels out there. So thanks for joining me, Keith, and thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Peace.